So Dan and Babs Izzett, lovely to have you here. You are a couple with a passion to rid the world of leprosy. Babs, why is that so important to you?
Well, the reason it's important to me is because both Dan and I have had leprosy. We were living in Zimbabwe. We both, he's a third generation Zimbabwean, I'm a second generation Zimbabwean.
And what were you doing out there?
Dan was doing civil engineering, so we were living out in the bush, right from the beginning of the dam to the end of the dam, we were out in the bush, so that's what we were doing at the beginning.
So Dan, how did you catch leprosy in a country where leprosy is barely known, and also usually there's poverty as an environment for leprosy? That wasn't the case there, was it?
That's absolutely the case. I can only work back statistically. Once I'd known that I'd been diagnosed with leprosy at the age of 25, I worked back and realized that when I first went to high school, round about the age of 12, 13, that I had lost sensation in my hands and had no idea. I just thought this happened to all young boys. So you go back 7 years from there, which is the incubation period, which is round about the age of 5 that I could have contracted leprosy.
So what was the point at which you first sought a diagnosis?
We'd been married. We got married in August 1970. And in the November, I came out in a rash all over my body, went to see a dermatologist who immediately said to me, he says, "Oh, I know what's wrong with you. You have syphilis."
That's pretty devastating for a wife to hear, Babs, isn't it? What was your reaction?
It was, well, we immediately, asked him the question, could that be true? Because both of us understood that we were virgins when we got married. So this was a real shock. And I said to him, "Are you sure, that you are a virgin?" And he said, "Absolutely."
So she was going to stick with you, but because you hadn't got the right diagnosis, how did that happen? And what was your reaction when you heard it was leprosy?
The reaction was terrible because I'd gone through on multiple treatments for syphilis, and each time the result came back positive for it. So eventually the doctors had no idea why it wasn't responding to the penicillin. Basically, that's what it was. Why? And I remember going to my doctor one day, who'd been my doctor for multiple years, physician, and he said, "Dan, we think you've got tertiary syphilis." So I said, "Dr. Gaskell, what is tertiary syphilis?" He said,
Even worse.
he said, "Al Capone had it, his brain went mad and died." So I thought, oh my goodness me, I've now fit into a whole different community that I had grown up in. And he said, "But we're going to do more tests on you." And I went to a consulting physician. And about 3 weeks later, he called me and he did multiple tests. He said, "We don't know what's wrong with you." And he took a scrape off my forehead. And that was then led me to going to the government doctor, who told me that I had Hansen's disease, which I had no idea what Hansen's disease was. I remember these the words. I said, "What the heck is Hansen's disease?" And he said, "It's lepromatous leprosy." Well, honestly, in half a second, my life flashed before me. I thought, this should be me locked away. They said, "Don't worry, we now treat you as an outpatient," because they now had the drugs in 1972. That's how the story was. So,
But what about you then, Babs? Because you then looked forward to a future where you could be married to a man who was very different to the one you'd recently married.
Well, I thought the same thing, that, they're going to lock him up. We had just recently seen Ben-Hur, and, there's quite a bit of the story is a mother and daughter who had leprosy, and they were put away into a cave. And so that was my first picture. They're going to take him away and lock him up, and I'm never going to see him again.
Did you think that she would stand by you, Dan? Did you worry?
well, what happened by the time we'd sort of calmed down and got our thoughts, I said to Babs, I said, "When I married you, I didn't know I had leprosy. Had I known I had leprosy, we would never have got married." So we'd only been married nearly 2 years, and I said, "We could annul our marriage, and you could start all over again." To which she replied, she says, "It wasn't a little while ago we stood before God and men, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and health, until death us do depart, not leprosy." She said, "We stood before God," and he said, "And also I love you." And that was it. We didn't go down that route again because we'd made that decision.
Nevertheless, you would have been aware of all the many years, right back to biblical times, as you said, of the stigma, the rejection of leprosy. How worried were you about that?
We discussed that. We discussed it with our minister at that time and other people. And they actually said, don't tell anybody. Keep it your secret, only on a need to be known basis. Share it. So that was my secret. And then a few years later when Babs was diagnosed with it sort of compounded the need to maintain it as a secret in our lives.
You were diagnosed too. Did you feel as if you had the sword of Damocles above your head, wondering if that would happen to you, or was that quite a shock?
It was a shock because we'd been told by the leprosy officer that there's very little chance that I would get it, and that only 5%, I'm not sure if we knew it at that time, that only 5% of people could get the disease. 95% were immune or self-healing. So we didn't think at all that I would get it, so it was quite a shock. I had an early diagnosis in 1977. It was only after I'd had a couple of patches and just a little numb patch on my arm that Dan had said to me, I think you must go and be tested for leprosy. So they tested me and I was positive, and this was in 1977. So I went on to the treatment, and because it was an early diagnosis and I went straight onto the treatment, I had no nerve damage. So, and then because we'd both now been diagnosed with leprosy, we both felt this is definitely part of God's plan for our lives. We need to get involved with work for leprosy sufferers. And that was at the start of it, but nothing ever materialized until we'd spoken out and given our testimony.
How did you feel when that happened to you?
You know, I think because now we knew a bit about the disease, it wasn't as traumatic as when Dan got the disease. We used to joke and say, oh, we share everything.
He could have kept that to himself, really. Yeah.
That was the one thing he could have done.
But Dan, physically, how has leprosy impacted on your life? What damage has it left in your
It's
body?
had a major impact because of the late diagnosis. I was diagnosed with a very high level of Mycobacterium leprae in my body. At that time, the diagnosis was lepromatous leprosy, which is the highest level of distinction in leprosy. I'm anesthetic to my elbows, above my knees, and about 70% of my face is anesthetic. I don't feel heat or cold or pricks or anything. Burns.
That's dangerous, of course, isn't it?
It is dangerous. As a result, I ended up with a leg amputation in 1980, having burnt my feet in 1977. Yeah.
And this leg, how did that get damaged then to the extent that you had to have it amputated?
Because of the lack of sensation and lack of perspiration, I got cracks in my heels. I didn't look after my heels at all. And one morning I decided that I'd put down a basin of hot water, stand in it so that my skin would all get soft, and then rub off the dead skin and deal with the crack like that. Well, you pour in hot water, you feel with anesthetic hands, so you have no idea what the temperature of the water is. And I stood in this water, shaved and cleaned up and got everything, rubbed all the dead skin off, put cream on, went to work, and came home that evening and said to Babs, there's something funny, my feet. No feeling. So I took my shoes off and literally I boiled both feet from my ankles down. Then an infection set in the right leg, and then 3 years later had the amputation.
How many prosthetics have you had since then?
I'm on number 25 at the moment.
Yes.
Due to get number 26 because this one's, I've outshrunk this one.
Well, obviously your hands have got that classic leprosy shape too, and you've lost a
Yes.
finger.
I lost a finger. I put my hands on a hot plate one day, unbeknown to me, and an infection. All these others healed except this one. I had an infection and it was amputated in October, November this year. Yeah.
Has it been a lifetime of pain with leprosy? How much
Yes,
pain have you suffered?
I have pain because of the neuralgia which takes place, particularly in this nerve up here. You know when you bump your elbow, you bump what they call the funny bone. It's not the funny bone, it's the humerus bone. That's why it's called the funny bone. And you get those pins and needles. I have that in both hands 24/7 for the last 50 years.
So it's been quite a challenge, hasn't it, to live with leprosy?
It has been. We've had our challenges.
Now, you two were both Christians, but I imagine that something like leprosy could make or shake the faith of anyone. What did it do to you, Dan?
I made a commitment to serve the Lord at the age of 5.5. I can remember that clearly. I remember the message that pastor preached. I remember walking to the front of the church, as was the practice of the church, and giving my life to the Lord. I then took a detour round about the age of 11, 12, and it wasn't until 25 that I came, 24, 25, that I came back to the Lord. So Christianity has played a major role. I had wonderful Christian parents. My father died when I was very young, 8 years old. But since then, we have served the Lord with everything that we know.
But what happened when leprosy suddenly became a shadow on your life?
We weren't serving the Lord then. But I think our characters carried us through, isn't it? This was a fact of life. There's nothing you can do about it. And as I said earlier on, we discussed about annulling our marriage. But we were just going to make the best of life.
So was there a pivotal moment in your experience of leprosy when suddenly you had a real sense that God was in this with you?
I was in hospital, and I was in what they call a type 2 reaction. My face was all swollen up. It looked like I'd done about 10 rounds with Mike Tyson. They were all swollen up, and I was in absolute agony and pain, just sort of lying in hospital. It was just after lunch. And suddenly there was a white light in the room. I have no idea what it was and then how long it was, but then suddenly my pastor pitched up to visit me. And he said, "What happened to you?" I said, "Oh, I don't know." He says, "You're different." So I sort of felt around, and I still had all the lumps and bumps there. And we discussed it, and he said, I think Jesus visited you." I said, "Oh, wow, Jesus still visits lepers, as in the olden days." Well, so that was sort of, I felt very happy about that. And then at visiting time, Babs came in, and she stepped over the threshold. She says, "What's happened to you?" And I said, "I know, Jesus visited me."
What's your reaction to that, Babs? What did you see, and how much effect has that had ever since?
Well, to me, there was something like light about him. He just looked so different, although he was still the same, you know, with the swellings, and on his face there was just a different glow. And I just knew something must have happened.
So what immediate effect did this have? Did it, for example, make you feel that you had a mission to share what you were going through with others, to come out, in other words?
I think it was, but it was still many years after that before we did come out. After my Jesus encounter, that was in the October of 74, later that month we really felt a call to go into ministry, but that did not materialize until 1981. And we spent some time being discipled in the church where we were. And then in 1986, we started our own church in a little town. CBC Centre was 3 streets by 3 streets where God placed us there up until retirement.
And now you're living here in this country.
Now we're living in the UK now, yes, to be with our children. It's payback time, I think. We were challenged by the Leprosy Mission to give our testimony because it was a little different. We were Caucasians, a husband and a wife, with a wife that got leprosy from her husband. We weren't poor. We'd had a good job. We were leaders of a church. So we were a different group of people other than sort of the normal run of people. But we were absolutely petrified to give our testimony. And so they said, "Okay, we want to put in the New Day magazine." And we hesitated. We said, "No." Then they said, "Well, we'll do it anonymously." We said, "We're not anonymous people." And I can remember one morning we were lying next to, I get up early, came back to bedroom and said, Leprosy Mission wants an answer, and we had these sort of white knuckle prayers, God, you've got to speak to us. And there was a verse that Mordecai spoke to his niece, and he said, for such a time like this. And those words stuck with us. We felt that was the reason for such a time like this. So we shared our testimony in church, and I told the Leprosy Mission, you couldn't print it until I told the church. I'd hate it if somebody opened up the Leprosy magazine and said, both our pastors have had leprosy. We wanted to tell our church first.
And that really was the start of a ministry of speaking out around the world, really. You're involved, aren't you, at international level in spreading that message?
We are. We have that privilege, yes.
What do you do?
Basically, we're retired now, so we're full-time advocacy work for people with leprosy.
Has that taken you to other countries where you are in communities of people with leprosy, as opposed to being very isolated, as you have been through your experience?
When we went to India, and there we met some of the leprosy sufferers. And the poverty, for me, was overwhelming. I just couldn't believe that these people were so poor and so dejected and rejected by their own families, by the people around them. It was just, for me, it was a very sad time in India.
So their experience of leprosy would have been very different to yours.
Very, very different. We couldn't believe. We realized then how good God had been to us, because it could have been so much worse.
You had the money to pay for your treatment.
Yeah, that's right.
What was it like for you, Dan, going into those communities? How did they react to you, this white man coming to talk to them?
Namaste. Do you see my hands? When I do that in India and say Namaste, they immediately see my hands and every barrier disappears.
That must have been very emotional for you. What did you do?
I wanted to hug them. I can remember being in Banjarmasin, and I went there. It was a Muslim group. And I said, what can I share with these people? I have so much more than what they have. But I just shared my life, tried to encourage them not to be ashamed of what's happened to them. It wasn't a sin. And afterwards, 3 men came to me and kissed me. Must have touched their lives. That's all that it's about.
And now you want to touch other lives by getting the message out to the world. What is that message?
The message, first of all, to leprosy sufferers: don't let stigma control your life. I know in some communities it's extremely difficult because the community holds stigma against you. And that's a hard one to fight through because you're automatically rejected. But I also want to encourage people to be a person. You are a person. It doesn't matter whether you have leprosy. It doesn't matter whether you have disabilities. I can remember being at a place in Zimbabwe, and there was a man there. He'd lost both hands. He'd lost a leg. And he was in this little village, and I was sitting on the floor with him on his veranda. I'd taken my leg off, and he was due to lose his second, and I could just see the medical condition. And his food came to him. And I thought, how's this man going to eat? He has stubs. Well, he picked up this dish and he scooped the food into his mouth. And as the nurse went away, I thought, or the helper, I thought, isn't it wonderful that we could help this lady who helps this man here? But then as I just sat there while he was eating his meal, I thought, this man's eating. He has natural consequences of eating. And then his very private actions that he has to do as a human being, somebody has to be there. Not for a short-term illness, but every day of his life. Once again, those are the people that force me or not force me, but to create a desire in me to, what can we do for them?
What would you say, Babs, to all the people that you meet, because you speak to churches, you speak to lots of people. If you're speaking to people in this country who have no experience of leprosy, in a country where at the moment especially there are so many needs that they would like to support, why support this one?
Well, because of the stigma, because they're rejected, they're so poor. Most of them are, it's a poverty that you can't explain, but it's such a deep heart-wrenching feeling that you just feel when you see them. And the stories are so sad that you just want to lift them out of where they are. As Dan says, you want to hug them. You want to tell them, God, you want to tell them, God is going to see you through this. You can't say this to everyone. But we can make a difference in their lives. Each one of us who are in that position to make a difference in their lives can make a difference.
And you felt, Dan, that Christ visited you at your most painful moment.
Yes.
What was he asking of you? Did he have a purpose in mind for you?
To make his presence real, I think, in a way, because when I link it up with Jesus visiting Simon's home, he chose Simon. He chose me. And I think that has been a driving force in me. Keep going, Dan. It doesn't matter how much it hurts. It doesn't matter how difficult it is. Sometimes traveling is hard. But we do it because there's somebody who will gain from it. I can remember we were in Switzerland. We'd been there for a couple of weeks, 3 weekends and 2 weeks. And we drove in with the head of Leprosy Mission. We drove into his home. He had a little room for us to stay in. And as we stopped, he says, "We've just traveled 2,500 kilometers on this tour going around." And I said, "You know what, Marcos? The man that's going to get a bandage has no idea how we've worked to get the finances." And anybody who supports the mission out of multiple, not everybody will support us, but those who do, thank you. You have no idea what your impact is. Maybe it's just to buy a bandage for someone with an ulcer on their foot, thousands of miles from you. And that's what we're the connection. We stand up and there could be 3 million people behind us who we represent, we're able to represent and do something for them.
The impact it's had on my faith has been to make me more aware of what goes on in other people's lives and the importance of sharing Jesus with them. And especially with leprosy, because we both had leprosy, I've seen what Dan has been through. So if we can help people in the same situation in any way to understand the love of God, to understand the goodness of God, the healing power of God, and how He never rejects us. So we're always accepted by Him, and it's been such a strong pull in our lives to be of use to the kingdom in serving others.
We've never allowed our illnesses to define us. But what we have taken every single opportunity because of the illness to speak about what the Lord has done for us. To us, leprosy is a tool to extend the kingdom of God because of the adverse circumstances that are surrounded by it. It proves that we do serve a God of love, a God that sustains us in hard times, and a God of great mercy and grace.